Hello, sweet dreamers. Welcome to Sound Bathing Whispers. On this channel, we bring you an ancient myth, folktale, or legend every week from a different part of the world. This channel is here to help you de-stress and relax, while also providing a safe space to fall asleep for a more rejuvenated tomorrow. There are so many ancient stories around the world to uncover, and I am excited to be your guide. If you like this content, please support this channel by liking this video, hitting subscribe and the bell notification for more tales, history, and relaxing sounds every week. Today, we are diving into 3 relaxing Nordic tales about King Halfdan, his son Harold, and Olaf, the Tooth-Roll, a servant. Friends, come take this journey with me to another ancient time. As always, before we begin our stories, let's start with our mindful deep breaths to help us relax. Begin by lying down flat on your back or sit on a comfortable chair, making sure your head is supported. Please close your eyes and settle in. Notice and invite your body to relax. Let yourself relax and become curious about your body laying down, the sensation it experiences, the touch, the connection with the floor, bed, or the chair. Do your best to relax any areas of tightness or tension. Again, without judgment, simply notice these sensations. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Notice the sensation of the air flowing in and out. Try to exhale a second or 2 longer than your inhale. So breathe in for 3 seconds, breathe out for 4 to 5 seconds. As you begin to breathe deeper, notice how the air fills your belly first and then your chest. As you slowly exhale, notice how the air leaves your chest first and then your belly. If you notice any thoughts coming into your mind, try not to judge them or force them out. Instead, just notice them and bring your mind back to your breathing. You may find it helpful to imagine the thoughts coming and going like a wave or floating by on clouds. Keep breathing. The purpose of mindful breathing is to anchor yourself in the present moment so that you can let go of worrying about the past or the future. Mindful breathing has been shown to reduce anxiety, help with burnout, provide certain types of pain relief, and decrease negative thinking. You should try doing this exercise for 5 minutes daily. And remember, whenever stressed, just breathe. Now, try to slow your breathing down a bit further. We will slowly count with each inhalation and exhalation. Feel your body relax even more with each breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. My friends, listen to these stories. Let's start with the region, cultural, and historical backstory where these stories take place. Iceland is a little country far north in the cold sea. People found it and went there to live more than 1,000 years ago during the Viking Age of exploration. It was settled by a mixed Norse and Celtic population. The early settlement, made up primarily of Norwegian seafarers and adventurers, fostered further excursions to Greenland and the coast of North America, which the Norse called Finland. During the warm season, they used to fish and make fish oil and hunt seabirds and gather feathers and tend their sheep and make hay. But the winters were long, dark, and cold. Men, women, and children stayed in the house, spun, wove, and knit. Just imagine a whole family sitting for hours around the fire in the middle of the room. The fire gave the only light. Shadows flitted in the dark corners. Smoke curled along the high beams in the ceiling. The children sat on the dirt floor close by the fire. The grown people were on a long narrow bench that they had pulled up to the light and the warmth. Everybody's hands were busy with wool. The work left the minds free to think and the lips to talk. What was there to talk about? The summer's fishing, the kill of a fox, or a voyage to Norway. But the people grew tired of this little gossip. Fathers looked at their children and thought, they are not learning much. What will make them brave and wise? What will teach them to love their country and old Norway? Will not the stories of battles, of brave deeds, of mighty men do this? So, as the family worked in the red firelight, the father told of the kings of Norway, of long voyages to strange lands, of good fights, and in farmhouses all through Iceland, these old tales were told over and over until everybody knew them and loved them. Some men could sing and play the harp. This made the stories all the more interesting. People called such men skalds, and they called their songs sagas. Every midsummer, there was a great meeting. Men from all over Iceland came to it and made laws. During the day, these were rest times when no business was going on. Then some skald would take his harp and walk to a large stone and stand on it and begin a song of some brave deed of an old Norse hero. At the first sound of the harp and the voice, people came running from all directions, crying out, "The skald, the skald, a saga." They stood about for hours and listened. They shouted applause. When the skald was tired, some other men would come up from the crowd and sing or tell a story. These tales were not written. Few men wrote or read in those days. Skalds learned sagas from hearing them sung. At last, people began to write more easily. Then they said, "These stories are very precious. We must write them down to save them from being forgotten." After that, many men in Iceland spent their winters in writing books. They wrote on sheepskin or vellum. Many of these old vellum books have been saved for hundreds of years. Some leaves are lost, some are torn, all are yellow and crumbled, but they are precious. They tell us all that we know about the olden times. The baby. King Halfdan lived in Norway long ago. One morning, his queen said to him, "I had a strange dream last night. I thought that I stood in the grass before my garden. I pulled a thorn from my dress. As I held it in my fingers, it grew into a tall tree. The trunk was thick and red as blood, but the lower limbs were fair and green, and the highest ones were white. I thought that the branches of this great tree spread so far that they covered all Norway and even more." "A strange dream," said King Halfdan. "Dreams are the messages of the gods. I wonder what they would tell us," and he stroked his beard in thought. Sometime after that, a serving woman came into the feast hall where King Halfdan was. She carried a little bundle in her arms. "My lord," she said, "a little son is just born to you." "Ha!" cried the king, and he jumped up from the high seat and rushed toward until he stood before the woman. "Show him to me," he shouted, and there was joy in his voice. The serving woman put down her bundle on the ground and turned back the cloth. There was a little naked baby. The king looked at it carefully. "It is an attractive youngster," he said, and smiled. "Bring Ivar and Thornstein." They were captains of the king's soldiers. Soon they came. "Stand as witnesses," Halfdan said. Then he lifted the baby in his arms, while the old serving woman brought a silver bowl of water. The king dipped his hand into it and sprinkled the baby, saying, "I own this baby for my son. He shall be called Harold. My naming gift to him is 10 pounds of gold." Then the woman carried the baby back to the queen's room. "My lord owns him for his son," she said, "and no wonder. He is perfect in every limb." The queen looked at him and smiled and remembered her dream and thought, "That great tree, can it be this little baby of mine?" The Tooth Roll. When Harold was 7 months old, he cut his first tooth. Then his father said, "All the young of my herds, lambs and calves and colts, then have been born. Since this baby was born, I this day give to him. I also give to him this thrall, Olaf. These are my tooth gifts to my son." The boy grew fast, for as soon as he could walk about, he was out of doors most of the time. He ran in the woods and climbed the hills and walked in the creeks. He was always with his tooth thrall. The king had said to Olaf, "Be ever at his call." Now this Olaf was full of stories, and Harold liked to hear them. "Come out to Eagle's Rock, Olaf, and tell me stories," he would say almost every day. So they started off across the hills. The man wore a long, loose coat of white wool, belted at the waist with a strap. He had on coarse shoes and leather leggings. Around his neck was an iron collar welded together so that it could not come off. On it were strange marks called runes that said, "Olaf, thrall of Halfdan." But Harold's clothes were brightly colored. A cape of grey velvet hung from his shoulders. It was fastened over his breast with great gold buckles. When it was waved in the wind, a scarlet lining flashed out, and the bottom of a little scarlet jacket showed. His feet and legs were covered with grey woolen tights. Gold lacing wound around his legs from his shoes to his knees. A band of gold held down his long, blonde hair. It was a wild country that these two were walking on. They were climbing steep, rough hills. Some of them seemed made all of rock. Great rocks hung out from them, with trees growing in their cracks. Some big pieces had broken off and rolled down the hill. "Thor broke them," Olaf said. "He rides down the sky and hurls his hammer at clouds and at mountains. That makes the thunder and the lightning and cracks the hills. His hammer never misses its aim, and it always comes back to his hand and is eager to go again." When they reached the top of the hill, they looked back. Far below was a soft green valley. In front of it, the sea came up into the land and made a fjord. On each side of the fjord, high walls of rock stood up and made the water black with shadow. All around the valley were high hills with dark pines on them. Far off were the mountains. In the valley were Halfdan's houses around the square yard. "How little our houses look down there," Harold said. "But I can see the red dragon on the roof of the feast hall. Do you remember when I climbed up and sat on his head, Olaf?" He laughed and kicked his heels and ran on. At last they came to Eagle's Rock and walked up on its flat top. Harold went to the edge and looked over. A rugged wall of rock reached down, and 200 feet below was the black water of the ford. Olaf watched him for a while. Then he said, "No whitening of your cheek, Harold." "Good. A boy that can face the fall of Eagle's Rock will not be afraid to face the war flash when he is a man." "Ah, I am not afraid of the war flash now," cried Harold. He threw back his cape and drew a little dagger from his belt. "See," he cried, Does this not flash like a sword? And I am not afraid. But after all, this is a baby thing. When I am 8 years old, I will have a sword, a sharp tooth of war. He swung his dagger as though it was a long sword. Then he ran and sat on the rock by Olaf. Why is this Eagle's rock? He asked. You know that Asgard is up in the sky, Olaf said. It is a wonderful city where the golden houses of the gods are in the golden grove. A high wall runs all around it. In the house of Odin, the All-Father, there's a great feast hall larger than the whole earth. Its name is Valhalla. It has 500 doors. The rafters are spears. The roof is thatched with shields. Armor lies on the benches. In the high seat sits Odin, a golden helmet on his head, a spear in his hand. 2 wolves lie at his feet. At his right hand and his left sit all the gods and goddesses, and around the hall sit thousands and thousands of men, all the brave ones that have ever died. Now it's good to be in Valhalla, for there is mead there better than men can brew, and it never runs out. And there are skalds that sing wonderful songs that men never heard. And before the doors of Valhalla is a great meadow where the warriors fight every day and get glorious and sweet wounds and give many. And all night they feast, and their wounds heal. But none may go to Valhalla except warriors that have died bravely in battle. Men who die as cowards go to Niflheim. There Hela, who is queen, always sneers at them, and a terrible cold takes hold of their bones, and they sit down and freeze. Years ago, Eager was a great warrior. Eager the big-handed, they called him. In many a battle his sword had sung, and he had sent many warriors to Valhalla. Many swords had bit into his flesh and left marks there, but never a one had struck him to death. So his hair grew white and his arms thin. There was peace in that country then, and Eager sorrowed, saying, I am old, battles are none, shall I not see Valhalla? Now, Odin say long ago, if a man is old and has come near death and cannot die in fight, let him find death in some brave way, and he shall feast with me in Valhalla. So one day, Eager came to this rock. A deed to win Valhalla, he cried. Then he drew his sword and flashed it over his head and held his shield high above him and leaped over into the air and died in the water of the ford. Harold jumped to his feet, cried, I think that Odin stood up before his high seat and welcomed that man gladly when he walked through the door of Valhalla. So the songs say, replied Olaf, for skalds still sing of that deed all over Norway. Olaf's farm. At another time, Harold asked, What is your country, Olaf? Have you always been a thrall? The thrall's eyes flashed. When you are a man, he said, and go a Viking to Denmark, ask men whether they ever heard of Olaf the Crafty. There, far off, is my country, across the water. My father was Gunbrand the Big. 200 warriors feasted in his hall and followed him to battle. He had 10 sons, and I was the youngest. One day he said, "You are all grown to be men. There is not elbow room here for so many chiefs. The eldest of you shall have my farm when I die. The rest of you off a-Viking." He had 3 ships. These he gave to 3 of my brothers, but I stayed that spring and built me a boat. I made her for only 20 oars because I thought few men would follow me, for I was young, 15 years old. I made her in the likeness of a dragon. At the prow, I carved the head with open mouth and forked tongue thrust out. I painted the eyes red for anger. "There stand so," I said, "and glare and hiss at my foes." In the stern, I curved the tail up almost as high as the head. There I put the pilot seat and a strong tiller for the rudder. On the breast and side I carved the dragon's scales. Then I painted it all black, and on the tip of every scale I put gold. I called her Wave Runner. There she sat on the rollers, as fair a ship as I ever saw. The night that it was finished, I went to my father's feast. After the meats were eaten and the mead horns came round, I stood up from my bench and raised my drinking horn high and spoke with a great voice. "This is my vow. I will sail to Norway, and I will harry the coast and fill the boats with riches. Then I will get me a farm and will winter in that land. Now who will follow me?" "He is but a boy," the men said. "He has opened his mouth wider than he can do." But others jumped to their feet with their mead horns in their hands. 30 men, one after another, raised their horns and said, "I will follow this lad, and I will not turn back so long as he and I live." On the next morning, we got into my dragon and started. I sat high in the pilot's seat. As our boat flashed down the rollers into the water, I made the song and sang it. So we harried the coast of Norway. We ate at many men's tables, uninvited. Many men we found overburdened with gold. Then I said, "My dragon's belly is never full." And on board went the gold. Oh, it is better to live on the sea and let other men raise your crops and cook your meals. A house smells of smoke, a ship smells of frolic. From a house you see a sooty roof, from a ship you see Valhalla. Up and down the water we went to get much wealth and much frolic. After a while my men said, "What of the farm, Olaf?" "Not yet," I answered. "Viking is better for summer. When the ice comes and our dragon cannot play, then we will get our farm and sit down." At last the winter came, and I said to my men, "Now for the farm. I have my eye on one up the coast, away in King Halfdan's country." So we set off for it. We landed late at night and pulled our boat up on shore and walked quietly to the house. It was rather a wealthy farm, for there were stables and a storehouse and a smithy at the sides of the house. There was but one door to the house. We went to it, and I struck it with my spear. "Hello, hello," I shouted, and my men made a great din. At last, someone from inside said, "Who calls?" "I call," I answered. "Open, or you will think it's Thor who calls." And I struck my shield against the door so that it made a great clanging. The door opened only a little, but I pushed it wide and leaped into the room. It was so dark that I could see nothing but a few sparks on the hearth. I stood with my back to the wall, for I wanted no sword reaching out of the dark for me. "Now start up the fire," I said. "Come, come," I called, when no one obeyed. "A fire! This is cold welcome for your guests." My men laughed. Yes, a stingy host. He acted as though he had not expected us. But now the farmer was blowing on the coals and putting on fresh wood. Soon it blazed up, and we could see about us. We were in a little feast hall, and its fire down the middle of it. There were benches for 20 men along each side. The farmer crouched by the fire, afraid to move. On a bench in a far corner were a dozen people huddled together. I called to them, "Bring in the table, we are hungry." Off they ran through a door at the back of the hall. My men came in and lay down by the fire and warmed themselves, but I set 2 of them as guards at the door. "Well, friend farmer," laughed one, "why such a long face? Do you not think we shall be merry company?" "We come only to cheer you," said another. "What man wants to spend the winter with no guests?" "Ah," another then cried out, sitting up, "here comes something that will be a welcome guest to my stomach." The servants were bringing in a great pot of meat. They set up the crane over the fire and hung the pot upon it, and we sat and watched it boil while we joked. At last the supper began. The farmer sat gloomily on the bench and would not eat, and you cannot wonder, for he saw us putting potfuls of his good beef and basket loads of bread into our big mouths. When the tables were taken out and the meat horns came around, I stood up and raised my horn and said to the farmer, "You would not eat with us. You cannot say no to half of my ale. I drink this to your health." Then I drank half of the hornful and sent the rest across the fire to the farmer. He took it and smiled, saying, "Since it is to my health, I will drink it." I thought that all this night's work would be my death. "Oh, do not fear that," I laughed, "for a dead man sets no tables." So we drank, and all grew merrier. At last I stood up and said, I like this little taste of your hospitality, friend farmer. I have decided to accept more of it." My men roared with laughter. "Come," they cried. "Thank him for that, farmer. Did you ever have such a lordy guest before?" I went on. "Now, there is no fun in having guests unless they keep you company and make you merry. So I will give out this law, that my men shall never leave you alone. Hakon, they shall be your constant companion. Friend farmer, he shall not leave you day or night, whether you are working or playing or sleeping. Leaf and Grim shall be the same kind of friend to your 2 sons. I named 9 others and said, and these shall follow your thralls in the same way. Now, am I not careful to make your time go merrily? So I set guards over every one in that house. Not once all that winter did they stir out of sight of some of us. So no tales got out to the neighbors. Besides, it was a lonely place, and by good luck, no one came that way. Oh, that was fat and easy living. Well, After we had been there for a long time, Hakan came into the feast one night and said, "I heard a cuckoo today." "It is the call to go a-Viking," I said. All my men put their hands in their mouths and shouted. Their eyes danced. Big Thorleaf stood up and stretched himself. "I am stiff with long sitting," he said. "I itch for a fight." I turned to the farmer. "This is our last feast with you," I said. "Well," he laughed, "this has been the busiest winter I've ever spent, and the merriest. May good luck go with you." "By the beard of Odin," I cried, "you have taken our joke like a man." My men pounded the tables with their fists. "By the hammer of Thor," shouted Grim, "here is no stingy coward. He is a man fit to carry my drinking horn, the horn of a sea rover and a sword swinger. Here, friend, take it." And he thrust it into the farmer's hand. "May you drink heart's ease from it for many years, and with it I leave you the name Sif the Friendly. I shall hope to drink with you sometime in Valhalla." Then all my men poured around that farmer and clapped him on the shoulder and piled things upon him, saying, "Here is a ring for Sif the Friendly, and here is a bracelet. A sword would not be ashamed to hang at your side." I took 5 great bracelets of gold from our treasure chest and gave them to him. The old man's eyes opened wide at all these things, and at the same time he laughed. "May Odin send me such guests every winter," he said. Early next morning, we took hands with our host and boarded the Wave Runner and sailed off. "Where shall we go?" my men asked. "Let the gods decide," I said, and tossed up my spear. When it fell on the deck, it pointed upshore, so I steered in that direction. That is the best way to decide, for the spear will always point anywhere, and one thing is as good as another. That time, it pointed us into your father's ship. They closed in battle with us and killed my men and sunk my ship and dragged me off a prisoner. They were 3 against 1, or they might have tasted something more bitter at our hands. They took me before King Halfdan. "Here," they said, "is a rascal who has been harrying our coast. We sunk his ship and men, but him we brought to you." "A robber king," said the king, and scolded at me. I threw back my head and laughed. "Yes, and with all your fingers, it took you a year to catch me." The king frowned more angrily. "Saucy too," he said. "While thieves must die, take him out, Thorkel, and let him taste your sword." Your mother, the queen, was standing by. Now she put her hand on his arm and smiled and said, "He is only a boy. Let him live, and would he not be a good gift for a baby?" Your father thought a moment, then looked at your mother and smiled. "Soft heart," he said gently to her. Then to Thorkel, "Well, let him go, Thorkel." Then he turned to me again, frowning. "But, young sharp tongue, now that we have caught you, we will put you into a trap that you cannot get out of, weld an iron collar on his neck." So I lived, and now am your true thrall. Well, it is the luck of war, but by the chair of Odin I kept my vow. "Yes," cried Harold, jumping to his feet, and had a joke into the bargain. "Ah, sometime I will make a brave vow like that." Harold is king. Now, when Harold was 10 years old, his father, King Halfdan, died. An old book that tells about Harold says that he was the biggest of all men, the strongest, and the fairest to look upon. That about a boy 10 years old. But boys grow fast in those days, for they were outdoors all the time, running, swimming, leaping on skis, and hunting in the forest. So now King Halfdan was dead and buried, and Harold was to be king. But first he must drink his father's funeral ale, take down the brightly colored tapestries that hung in the feast hall. He said to the thralls, "Put up black and grey ones, strew the floor with pine branches, brew 20 tubs of fresh ale and mead, scour every dish until it shines." Then Harold sent messengers all over that country to his kinsmen and friends. "Bid them come in 3 months' time to drink my father's funeral ale," he said. "Tell them that no one shall go away empty-handed." So in 3 months men came riding up at every hour. Some came in boats, but many had ridden far through mountains, swimming rivers, for there were few roads or bridges in Norway. At 9 o'clock in the night, the feast began. The men came walking in the west end of the hall. The great bonfires down the middle of the room were flashing light on everything. The clean smell of his wood smoke and the pine branches on the floor was pleasant to the guests. Down each side of the hall stretched long, backless benches with room for 300 men. In the middle of each side rose the high seat, a great carved chair on a platform. All along behind the benches were black and grey tapestries. Here hung the shields of the guests, for every man, when he was given his place, turned and hung his shield behind him and set his tall spear by it. So on each wall there was a long row of brightly colored shields, red and green and yellow, and all shining with gold or bronze trimmings. And higher up there was another row of gleaming spear points. Above the hall the rafters were carved and gaily painted, so that dragons seemed to be crawling across or eagles seemed to be swooping down. The guests walked in laughing and talked with their big voices so that the rafters rang. They made the hall look all the brighter with their clothes of scarlet and blue and green, with their flashing golden bracelets and their heads bands and sword scabbards, with their flying hair of red or yellow. Across the east end of the hall was a bench. When the men were all in, the queen, Harold's mother, and the woman who lived with her walked in through the east door and sat upon this bench. Then thralls came running in and set up the long tables before the benches. Other thralls ran in with large steaming kettles of meat. They put big pieces of this meat into platters of wood and set it before the men. They had a few dishes of silver. These they put before the guests at the middle of the table, for the great people sat here near the high seats. When the meat came, the talking stopped, for Norsemen ate only twice a day, and these men had had long rides and were hungry. 3 or 4 persons ate from one platter and drank from the same big bowl of milk. They had no forks, so they ate from their fingers and threw the bones under the table among the pine branches. Sometimes they took knives from their belts to cut the meat. When the guests sat back satisfied, Harold called to the thralls, "Carry out the tables." So they did, and brought in 2 great tubs of mead and set one at each end of the hall. Then the queen stood up and called some of her women. They went to the meat tubs. They took the horns, then the thralls had filled them, and carried them to the men with some merry word. Perhaps one woman said as she handed a man his horn, "This horn has no feet to be set down upon. You must drink it at one draught." Perhaps another said, "Mead loves a merry face." The women were beautiful, moving about the hall. The queen wore a trailing dress of blue velvet with long flowing sleeves. She had a short apron of striped Arabian silk with gold fringe along the bottom. From her shoulders hung a long train of scarlet wool embroidered in gold. White linen covered her head. As she walked, her train made a pleasant rustle among the pine branches. She was tall and straight and strong. Some of her younger women wore no linen on their heads and had their arms bare, with bracelets shining on them. They too were tall and strong. All the time, men were calling across the fire to one another, asking news or telling jokes and laughing. An old man, Harold's uncle, sat in the high seat on the north side. That was the place of honor. But the high seat on the south side was empty, for that was the king's seat. Harold sat on the steps before it. The feast went merrily until long after midnight. Then the thralls took some of the guests to the guest house to sleep, and some to the beds around the sides of the feast hall. But some men lay down on the benches and drew their cloaks over themselves. On the next night, there was another feast. Still Harold sat on the steps before the high seat. But when the tables were gone and the horns were going around, he stood up and raised high a horn of ale and said loudly, "This horn of memory I drink in honor of my father Halfdan, son of Gudrod, who sits now in Valhalla, and I vow that I will grind my father's foes under my heel." Then he drank the ale and sat down in the king's high seat, while all the men stood up and raised their horns and shouted, "King Harold!" And some cried, "That was a brave vow." And Harold's uncle called out, "A health to King Harold," and they all drank it. Then a man stood up and said, "Hear my song of King Halfdan," for this man was a skald. "Yes, the song," shouted the men, and Harold nodded his head. So the skald took down his great harp from the wall behind him and went and stood before Harold. The bottom of the harp rested on the floor, but the top reached as high as the skald's shoulder. The brass frame shone in the light. The strings were some of gold and some of silver. The man struck them with his hand and sang of King Halfdan, of his battles, of his strong arm and good sword, of his death, and of how men loved him. When he had finished, King Harold took a bracelet from his arm and gave it to him, saying, "Take this as thanks for your good song." The guests stayed the next day, and at night there was another feast. When the mead horns were going around, King Harold stood up and spoke. "I said that no man should go away empty-handed from drinking my father's funeral ale." He beckoned the thralls, and they brought in a great treasure chest and set it down by the high seat. King Harold opened it and took out rich gifts of capes and sword belts and beautiful cloth and bracelets and gold cloak pins. These he sent about the hall and gave something to every man. The guests wondered at the richness of his gifts. "This young king has an open hand," they said, "and deep treasure chests." After breakfast the next morning, the guests went out and stood by their horses ready to go. But before they mounted, thralls brought a horn of mead to each man. That was called the stirrup horn, because after they drank it, the men put their feet to the stirrups and sprang upon their horses and started. King Harold and his people rode a little way with them. All men said that that was the richest funeral feast that ever was held.